Bruchim habayim, and welcome to our final session of Cup of Kabbalah. Our cups are multiplying. And in fact, it is illustrative of the fact that we have barely scratched the surface of Kabbalistic teachings. There are so many cups yet to fill, or, depending on your perspective, so many cups that must be emptied, or if you're into, quantum physics, so many cups that we don't know whether they're full or empty. All right, anyway, I've given you 10 little sessions on Kabbalistic doctrine and ideas. This is the 10th, and there's so much more to talk about. There are so many more ideas, so many more developments that are worth exploring, that if this has been compelling to you, maybe when I come back from my sabbatical, we can form a class and continue our studies. But in any case, this is our final wrap up. I'm going to introduce you to one more concept, doctrine, if you wish, of Kabbalism, and then talk a little bit about what we have not talked about. So the doctrine I want to talk to you about is the doctrine of correspondence. And correspondence is the idea that what happens in the material world is mirrored in the spiritual world. And I'm using a spatial metaphor here, right? Up and down. Ignore the metaphor, or go beyond the metaphor and realize that we're not talking about a verticality. Anyway, that there's a correspondence between the material world and the spiritual world, which makes perfect sense if we're talking about the idea that what is happening in the divine realm influences us, but it's a positive feedback system, and what we do down here influences what's going on high. And so correspondence is a critical aspect of classical Kabbalistic thought, and it, I think, probably, at least in part, has its origins in early Greek philosophy. Plato believed in a system of ideas, and that there were ideal forms, that however different these cups may seem, there is the ideal form of a cup that exists in a ideal space or place in the world, and that it embodies all cupness. And however many different variations you have on a cup, tall, short, handle, no handle, thermal liner, whatever, all of those are anticipated in the ideal cup on high. And likewise, in Jewish tradition, we have this idea that there are certain fundamental Jewish things that have correspondence above and below, the first of which is the Torah itself. Right from antiquity, the rabbis were talking about how the Torah pre-existed creation, and that in fact it is the blueprint that God used in the creation of the world. So imagine God as an architect, and the Torah provides the blueprint. So there is an ideal Torah, and you'll see this in later Jewish mysticism. There is a very famous discussion in the Zohar about the idea that the Torah we possess is only a sort of vague projection of the ideal Torah on high. And in that discussion, it uses the images of clothing, body, and soul. And what we see physically as the Torah is simply the garment, the clothing. When we read into it, and we read the commandments, and we read the teachings, not necessarily the obvious teachings, but the esoteric teachings, well, now we're looking at the body of the Torah. And then if you really look even deeper into it, you discover something akin to what the Torah is in its reality, which is this supernal entity that transcends its words, transcends its materials, and serves as the chief assistant of God in the cosmos. So there's an example of correspondence for you. Another example is the idea that just as there is a Jerusalem below, a real Jerusalem in the land of Israel, which never goes away, it's always there, whether it's built up or ruined. It's this geographic location, but there's also a Jerusalem on high. And just as there's a physical temple here, there is a spiritual temple above. Just as the priesthood serves the physical temple, the angels serve as the priesthood in the spiritual temple. And some will get so elaborate in their interpretation as to talk about who's the high priest. Is it Michael? Is it Metatron? All these different speculative ideas come out along all of this. But the fundamental idea is that there are some things in our world so rooted in the essence of what must be, of necessary being, that it has its own version above. Two examples I've just suggested were the Torah, Jerusalem, 3, the temple. The 4, probably the one that we most see emphasized in Kabbalistic thought, and the one that they more fully develop, is us. And this runs akin to the Greek notion of the macrocosm and the microcosm, that the macrocosm is the universe writ large, but that there can be a small exemplar that embodies everything in the nature of the macrocosm in a small form. And in Jewish tradition, that's us. All right, we are the microcosm. In Hebrew, we talk about the macrocosm as olam gadol, and we talk about us as olam katan, a small universe. And actually that becomes a term in Kabbalism synonymous with being a human being. Now, this is a great intuition. Long before we knew anything about the origins of the universe, scientifically, the Big Bang, things like this, we had this sense that we are utterly and completely connected to everything. I'm thinking of not Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. They sing the song Woodstock, and they say, we are stardust, we are, and we're stardust. We're absolutely stardust. We are an accumulation of all those things that make up the universe. And Kabbalism, hundreds of years before we even knew anything about the physics or the celestial mechanics of the universe, sensed that and realized that, so that we are intimately connected to everything around us. And of course, you can see how that would extrapolate out into all kinds of important ideas about our relationship to everything, our connectedness to everything, our oneness with everything. Very important idea. And now, there is a limit to how much intuition they could do. One of the other intuitions that came with Kabbalism is that, hey, human beings, we look like this, right? So we have arms and legs and hands and a head and et cetera, et cetera. And if God is not human shaped, the universe is. So there's this, you see in medieval Kabbalah, this discussion of the idea that the universe is anthropomorphic. And again, this ties into a whole bunch of other Kabbalistic things, the idea of the left and the right, the idea of male and female. Really, if you scramble it down to its base, the medieval Kabbalists thought that the universe was a, I don't know, anthropomorphic, hermaphroditic entity. That science has not been able to verify, and probably pretty much disputes. Science tends to go a little bit more to the earliest intuition that things tend to be more round But even then that's not so true. It starts to become strings and spirals of galaxies and things like this. So anyway, okay, so we got a little bit further with Kabbalah in our understanding of our relationship to the universe, but not as far as we've gotten today. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and say that I've taught you enough about early Kabbalah and classical Kabbalah that you at least have some of the fundamental ideas. You see hints of how it may be applicable, sometimes not applicable, to our modern world, our modern experiences, our modern intuitions, and evidentiary knowledge about the world. But it's a way of looking at the world, and I think it's a valuable one. Now, as I said, we can get together afterwards, and I can continue to teach you. There are things that we have not yet touched about. One of the most famous, just to give you an example, is Isaac Luria, who was writing in the 16th century, and his famous cosmology, his notion of the formation and failure and restoration of the universe, his creation myth, which is an extrapolation on, but also a variation from the traditional Jewish creation myth that we all know from the book of Genesis. It has proved to be incredibly influential, an incredibly important view of the world, and also, again, taps into what we do in modern Judaism, the phrase tikkun olam, which actually precedes Luria, but becomes imbued with a new importance, that really we are partners with God in mending the world, in making the world more perfect, comes in large part from Luria's mythic vision of how the world came to be. We're not going to talk about that, don't have time, but there's lots more to explore. There's so much going on in Kabbalah. It's such a rich literature with so many interesting insights into humanity, the world, and God, that it's worth looking at. Now, look, I am going to say this. Look, at much of what you've heard here is based on this, my book, Sefer HaBahir. I published this a few years ago, 2017, with the purpose of using it to teach Kabbalah to university students. Fact of the matter is that since those years have passed, the 5 years since then, the book has gone out of print. And but for a $10 gift, I feel like a televangelist. For a $10 gift, I'll give you the entire PDF of this book so that you can read it from cover to cover. And yes, you'll probably hear phrases and words that echo what I've been saying here, but it's a 200-page book. There's so much more going on. It mostly is interested in the storytelling, especially the parables, the Kabbalistic parables that appear in classic Kabbalah, and Sefer HaBahir is a major source of Kabbalistic parables. So if you want to continue your reading independent of me, you can get this from me for a $10 donation, or you can read something else. Over the summer, there's so many books that are available. Anything by Arthur Green is worth reading. Aidan Steinsalt's The 13-Petaled Rose is an excellent modern introduction to Kabbalah, and also the writings of Lawrence Kushner, my colleague and fellow Reform rabbi, has published a number of books that are either inspired by or directly addressing the theme of Kabbalah. He has a book called Kabbalah, A Love Story. There's a direct thing to tap into. Some of the more meditative works he's done based on Kabbalah are River of Light or Honey from the Rock. So there's a great number of available pieces of literature for you to continue your learning. And then when I return, we'll see what we want to do. Well, in any case, it has been a pleasure filling my cups, emptying my cups, learning with you. I hope it's been interesting, and I look forward to seeing you again in the fall. Lehitraot, my friends, until we see each other again.